Here we are for another round of the 70s versus the 90s, and it's a travel through space and time and everything in between when I put Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey against Brian De Palma's Mission to Mars. And man, this was one trippy experience. So, I mean, let's just dive right on in. I mean, first up, Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey is a true masterpiece. I mean, the special effects alone are just incredible. That's the only Oscar that Kubrick ever won in his career was for the special effects in this movie, and he put together, some of the best technicians for this. They make this shit look real. And mind you, this was made in 1968, and it has you feel like you're there in space. Nothing in this film feels like unrealistic, even with the whole space traveling and stuff. Either the very beginning with the Dawn of Man sequences, it clearly looks like there's clearly people in monkey suits and stuff, and that kind in any other director's hands, that shit would be ludicrous as all hell. But in the hands of Kubrick, he really does something special with it, and it's the use of music in this film. It's like a ballet almost. It's so beautiful. And of course, there's very erotic undertones as the ships docking into the station and stuff. It's just and of course his obsession with toilets. But then a zero gravity toilet, that shit's got to be insane. It's a lot of fucking rules to go by and stuff. And what's cool about the film itself, like mind you, it's based off of the book written by Arthur C. Clarke, who co-wrote the script with Kubrick. But I've never read the book, so people that read the book may have more insight into what the hell the movie's about. People that have dropped acid to this movie or any other kind of hallucinogenic or drug or whatever the fuck may have a different perspective on it. The whole point is, like, anybody on whatever level of consciousness or wherever the fuck you're from who's seen this film has a perspective on what this movie's about. And on the surface though, it really kind of just, it tells you, but it's so like understated and stuff. Also, I mean, the pacing of it is kind of slow, but it's intentionally slow. But I still think maybe you could shave like 30 minutes off of. You don't really need an intermission or anything. Maybe in the theaters, I guess, at that length, just 2.5 hours, it seems kind of like the normal length of a movie. I feel like you don't really need an intermission unless the film's over 3 hours. But that's just my personal opinion. I don't know how to create a cinematic experience. Kubrick obviously did. Nobody, with the exception of maybe Christopher Nolan with Interstellar, has come close to even matching the level of artistry and the attention to detail that he has in this movie. And it's why you can almost forgive him for these long takes, because you really need time to absorb all of this shit that these motherfuckers went through, like just painstaking hours to fucking like make look realistic for the big screen and shit. That's why they wanted Kubrick to like stage the moon landing for them in case it fucked up. They wanted it to look as realistic as possible. That's why I don't believe it was staged, because it doesn't look Kubrick level good. So I don't think, anyways, we're not getting on that rabbit hole. This ain't conspiracy theory hour. It's fucking 70s versus 90s. We're talking about movies and shit, but there's always some layer of bullshit creeping in somehow. But all in all though, like I honestly couldn't fully tell you what the hell the movie's about, honestly, when they go to these monoliths keep popping up over time and shit. And it's basically, for my interpretation, aliens telling, beings how to evolve and shit, use tools to like kill and fucking do all this shit. And then, they see that shit on the moon and it fucks them up. And then, then they send these motherfuckers to Jupiter, because that's where the damn signal's transmitting and shit. And then when they, and then also they've got to overcome a fucking, a salty AI unit named Hal that runs the ship and everything. He ends up killing the whole crew. And, one motherfucker is able to outsmart him and get through, and then goes on the head trip of his life, all through past, present, future, and being reborn as the fucking Star Child and shit. These monolith motherfuckers show him the secrets of the universe. And one of the most trippy sequences, and mind you, people that dropped acid to go see this movie, they probably peaked around the time that shit went down. And so I can only imagine the shit was a hell of an experience. These motherfuckers felt just as like, just as fucking fucked up or whatever, just as enlightened as he got as an old man in that fucking badass light up room at the end. you know. And granted, the Star Child shit is a little fucking creepy, but that music, and you're just like, what the fuck, you know. And so I mean, nobody can top Kubrick, and you know, let alone somebody like Brian De Palma, who for most of his career, you know, at the beginning of his career, he tried to be Godard, Jean-Luc Godard, and then for the rest of his career, he basically tried to be Alfred Hitchcock, and he was better at being Hitchcock than he was at being Godard, in my opinion. But in Mission to Mars, you can see him, you know, really like the heavy influence, as most people who've ever done a space movie subsequently from 2001: A Space Odyssey, they're all emulating Kubrick, you know, and in anybody in any cinematic fashion, you know, what, not just 2001, but every Kubrick film, everybody's essentially either doing Kubrick, Kurosawa, or Hitchcock. So, you know, and I'm not for sure if De Palma's done Kurosawa, but he's done plenty of Hitchcock, and this is basically his attempt at doing a Kubrick film, you know, which is pretty ambitious, you know. But and then the cast, you know, what was beautiful about 2001: A Space Odyssey, there weren't really any like big name actors, at least not in the States or anything. And you know, it feels a little more realistic as far as like these people, you know, stone cold professionals, almost robotic fashion, you know, but they're just, you know, intergalactic travelers and shit, you know. Whereas in Mission to Mars, we see, you know, this is more, you know, kind of movie star actors and shit. You know, Gary Sinise, you can kind of believe him as a astronaut and stuff, but they throw way too much drama in it to try to make the ending pay off more, and they fucking fail to do that because the ending itself is lame. You know, instead of Jupiter, they're going to Mars. You know, and there's a failed there's some kind of fucking force that ends up taking the crew of Mars One. So then they send a rescue mission, and you know, Gary Sinise, he's not supposed to be doing missions, but he's the only one that can, type shit. You know, that usual trope that they use in these kind of dramas and shit. And Jerry O'Connell is just the silly motherfucker, and then Tim Robbins, you know, good at playing a dick, and then, you know, him and Connie Nielsen is as a married couple, you know, adds another extra layer of drama that's probably not needed. You know, it's like these certain things, you know, they would be shocking, you know, they honestly still not as shocking as when Hal cuts that cord and lets the one dude fucking just fly off into space and with the other fucking rover and shit. And, you know, that's way more chilling than when Tim Robbins takes that fucking helmet off and shit. So it's like the movie itself lacks passion, and for the most part, where there's not a moment in 2001: A Space Odyssey where the special effects don't look real. There's plenty of times where, like, in fucking Mission to Mars, that shit looks fake as fuck, especially the Mars sequences. I mean, honestly, Paul Verhoeven did Mars better with Total Recall. It's like, granted, I've never been to Mars, but as far as, like, what just kind of feels like, you know, how you would expect Mars type thing, you know. And it's like even The Martian by Ridley Scott. So it's like this one is just like bare minimum type shit. And even, you know, they kind of like explain everything to you in a way that 2001 doesn't. You know, they're basically saying the same thing, but 2001, you know, wants you to figure out the answer on your own, where it's like Mission to Mars is spoon feeding you everything you need to feel, everything you need to know. And, you know, that's not really the cinema, you know. There's ways of doing ambiguous cinema and making it work, and Kubrick was one of the best at that. You know, he could just end the movie on a fucking sad note, fucking whatever, you know, right in the middle of when you think the catharsis is supposed to be, but it's like, you know, you as an audience need to figure it out and shit. You know, don't fucking rub shit in my face. You know, it's all bullshit fantasy, you know. It kind of ends, you know, Mission to Mars kind of ends like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, you know, with Richard Dreyfuss's character. You know, I was born to do this. This means something. That stuff is just lame, tired, and hack as fuck. And it don't amount to a hill of beans in the grand cinematic scheme because, you know, Mission to Mars, nobody really gives a fuck other than like the few people that saw it in theaters and thought it was cool to say it was better than 2001. When in fact they didn't know shit about the cinema, because, you know, clearly this round's got to go to 2001: A Space Odyssey, you know, because nobody can really top Kubrick, you know. I mean, there may be a few, you know, like I said, Kurosawa and some of Hitchcock's better stuff, but, you know, Kubrick, we're all sons of Kubrick, man. Nobody can fuck with that guy, and he proved like there's no computers and no nothing. They did all practical effects. This motherfucker designed it, coordinated it himself, and got some of the best technicians to like take you to fucking space like you had never been before, like a year before we actually go to set foot on the fucking moon, you know. So if anybody's keeping score, that's 23-24. The 90s are still up by 1, but man, like I said, the 70s, man, they're great for a reason. And I mean, even though Kubrick only did essentially 3 films in what is the period of the new Hollywood from 1967 to, well, I guess technically 4 if we're counting 1980, because that's when The Shining came out. So and still, like, smoked most of the motherfuckers that were going in that decade. But just the little men, it's more a quality over quantity type thing. It's the kind of shit that Tarantino talks about. You got to know when to quit. Then knowing unless you're going to make a movie, know what the fuck you want to make. And at this point, De Palma's a clear-cut example of that, because at this point in his career, did he really give a fuck about making Mission to Mars or any of the other shit? Like, honestly, everything after Carlito's Way was just drivel, and man, he probably done making movies now, but he should have been done a long time ago. But I guess once you get to doing something, it's hard to stop doing it, even if you're making just some of the worst shit that not only you've made, but like most people have made, So 90s up by 1 still, but 70s, like I said, they keep coming back. They won this round. 2001 A Space Odyssey, like I said, any level of consciousness you're on, probably better if you're on hallucinogenics, but the more you watch it, the more you understand what they were trying to say. And it's more show instead of tell, whereas Mission to Mars is more tell and show. And as we've seen with previous matchups, that usually when they don't, the less you show, the better, because the more you can imagine is way more intriguing than the shit people can show. And Mission to Mars is a clear example of that, because like this is like, it's one of those movies. It's like getting a really good like blowjob and then they just stop in the middle and take a shit on you. That's the way it is. So if I've said anything you disagree with, anything I've said wrong, whatever the fuck, feel free to eviscerate me in the comments. I don't care. Like I said, I'm just working out a rough draft to a doctoral thesis. This is fun for me. That's how sad my life is.